You're listening to episode 259 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Lama Rod Owens joins us to speak about his new book, Radical Dharma, Talking Race, Love, and Liberation. Hi everyone. Before we begin today's episode, I'd like to mention that this podcast and the supporting website, discussion forums, our live online practice circle, and other services provided by the Secular Buddhist Association are supported by you. If you find this episode or any other offerings helpful to you in some way, I ask that you take a moment and visit secularbuddhism.org and click on the contributions button. There are many ways you can help, which are listed on that page. And if you make a donation, it's tax deductible, and it helps ensure the SBA is able to continue the exploration of secular Buddhism. Thank you. We're glad to have you join us in the conversation. If you've listened to this podcast regularly, you already know we make a point of having guests with a wide diversity of views, backgrounds, and practices. This is not just because we at the SBA have a personal passion and interest in inclusivity and social action, though many of us do, but because this is one of the common threads in the colorful tapestry of secular Buddhism, diversity and inclusion. We see that as a strength, perhaps as a manifestation of Buddhism's encounter with modernity, but also because we're people living in this society, so rife right now with racial tensions. Making sure we openly discuss these issues, even knowing we'll make mistakes, we'll get upset, we'll learn about our edges, is something we expect is critical to fostering positive change. Lama Rod Owens is a graduate of the traditional 3-year retreat program at Kagyu Tubten Choling Monastery, where he received his teaching authorization from his root teacher, the Venerable Lama Norla Rinpoche. He is currently a resident teacher with Natural Dharma Fellowship in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and is pursuing his graduate studies in Buddhism at Harvard Divinity School. He has served as the Lama and Program Director of Kagyu DC, a Tibetan Buddhist Dharma Center and community in Washington, D.C. Lama Rod also specializes in applying the teachings of Mahamudra meditation in exploring racial and gender constructs, healing woundedness from trauma and other violence, as well as integrating spirituality and sexuality. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice intersectionality. That one's for you, Lama Rod. Our guest today is Lama Rod Owens. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Ted. It's so nice to be on here.
I'm very glad to have you as what I hope will be a 3-part episode along with your co-authors of Radical Dharma. But first, I wanted to start by asking you to tell us about your background.
Absolutely. I grew up in the South in Georgia, outside of Atlanta. I grew up with my mother, a single Black woman who worked, and kind of came up within the context where I was really exposed to the difficulty of surviving, the difficulty of staying housed and fed, the struggle of competing with others who had more material wealth than you, or more material wealth than my mother and I had. All that really deeply influenced the work that I would do. And I was also very much influenced by my mother, who, at the age of, when I was 12, actually, she began to enter into the ministry. So we were members of the United Methodist Church, and she felt a calling to enter into training to be a local minister, a local pastor. And when she began that process, eventually she was able to start pastoring her own churches in the part of Georgia we lived outside of Atlanta. And that was really deeply impactful for me in a way that I didn't realize that until much later in my life. So I was kind of raised in this situation where it was difficult, but at the same time, there was this really intense example of how one can integrate spiritual practice with a concern for social change and social justice. And my mother really encouraged me to do that by encouraging me to get involved in community service, by, helping out at our church, by doing school groups and organizations that did work in the community. She was extremely supportive in that. On her end, she was very involved in community service herself. She would organize groups and programs that helped young women, young girls in the public school system. She would organize health fairs and was very involved in particularly sexual health amongst young people. And so I really witnessed that and saw that kind of growing up, especially moving through my adolescence and late teens. So that was like the foundation of my growing up. Another important aspect, I think, in my upbringing was kind of my appreciation of academics. And so I did fairly well in school. I wasn't like at the top of the class, but I did well enough. And that really opened up a lot of doors for me, particularly in going to a good college and really finding myself in spaces where I was really challenged academically and intellectually. And I really always appreciated that challenge. And that all of that really kind of fed back into the ways in which I started creating an awareness and an analysis of who I was socially and relatively as a Black male. And, when I came out and identified myself as gay and queer, then that added another kind of layer of analysis. And all of that kind of started working together. And I kind of became very, very much interested in the idea of intersectionality.
More about that. It's one of the things that comes up a lot in your work. I want to hear more about that in particular.
Well, early in my life, I didn't know what intersectionality was. But what I knew was that I had these different identities, and so much work went into understanding what these identities meant, and how these identities carried privilege and how other identities carried a kind of disprivilege. And that when I tried to oversimplify my life, that's when I suffered the most. So when I tried to oversimplify my life to just expressing myself as a Black person within the social context, it always felt short, because there were these other identities that also deeply informed the way that I experience race. So queerness deeply influences and informs the way that I experience race, as well as gender, as well as class, as well as being born in the South, as well as being born to a single parent, as well as being someone with inclination to do well in academic environments. So I was really interested in how I showed up differently in different spaces. And in my early 20s, actually, I really started identifying actually the ways in which I compartmentalized my identities and really had some really important breakthroughs around that. And from that realization, I was able to start asking myself, okay, what is the space that I occupy where these different identities come together? And again, in my early 20s and through my 20s, actually, I wasn't using the language of intersectionality, but I was definitely practicing intersectional theory.
Well, it's interesting that you were noticing that these single identities, just identifying as a black male or as someone practicing in Christianity or as X or as Y or something, wasn't doing it, that we're more complicated than that, and that the suffering comes from trying to oversimplify this ossified ideal of what we're supposed to be that might not be a right fit for us.
Absolutely. At some point, I had to acknowledge complexity. And complexity is honestly one of my favorite words right now because it helps me to actually create a home within the grayness of what it means to be alive. We try to make everything black and white. Even racism, we try to make about black and white, but it's much more complex than that. And when I started discovering there were these shades of gray, more than just 50 shades of gray, but countless shades of gray, I felt relieved. I felt relieved that I could practice confusion.
And that's a beautiful way to put it, because it is something that we experience on a regular basis. I know I certainly do. And being okay with not knowing, being okay with, I don't have all the answers.
And and it helps me to judge myself less and to have more compassion and patience for myself. Because yes, I have these very radical progressive ideas, but sometimes I can be very conservative and very fundamental about certain things, and instead of judging myself for being fundamental or conservative on these issues, I actually relax and say, this is part of my complexity, and then I step further and say, okay, I have these conservative views. How do these conservative views actually harm myself or others? Or on the other hand, how do my radical progressive views harm myself and others? So no matter where I'm at, I try to interrogate that positionality. So radical doesn't always mean healthy and good. And conservatism, fundamentalism doesn't always mean harmful and wrong. And so we have to practice a kind of what I call radical honesty.
And that's very difficult, even questioning what one might see as a very positive idea, and just asking, well, what about this part, can lead to instant condemnation instead of, I understand that's a difficult question and it's worthy of exploration and not derision. That's what we're seeing a lot of today. That's, I think, hindering the conversation and the change.
Yeah, I think for me, a really perfect personal example of this would be abortion. Because personally, in my personal beliefs, I am pro-life. I believe in sustaining life, promoting life, protecting life, even in the womb.
And yet, if you use that view in certain contexts, there's a judgment that comes.
Well, there's a judgment, and for me, I have to be very careful because publicly or politically, I would say I am pro-choice. So there has to be a separation. I personally believe this, but personally, again, this goes back to intersectionality. Personally, I am a cisgendered male, so I am someone who, was given the identity marker of being a male, and this is the identity that I agree with. So that's what I mean by cisgender. So I'm a cisgendered male, and I'm not female bodied or female gendered. So I recognize my positionality. So I say, okay, I don't actually have a right to determine what a female bodied person chooses.
And yet still honor your own inclinations
Right.
about difficult subject.
Right. And I've had plenty of friends who decided, to have abortions, and it's been no judgment, and that's the complexity. So I have these personal views, but at the same time, I'm okay with people practicing what they need to practice to be okay.
It's challenging having that disagreement without a value judgment. So tell me, how did this progress in your life where you encountered and resonated with and became a teacher Buddhism?
So I left Georgia after I finished undergrad, about the age of 23, and this was the early 2000s, and moved to Boston. I moved into a community called Haley House. It was an intentional community informed by the tradition of the Catholic worker movement. And, I talk about this in Radical Dharma, but, I really got involved in activism in undergrad in a location, an environment, a school community that was very conservative, very fundamental, and was very wounding for me, very traumatizing. So I graduated, kind of beginning to radicalize consciously, but didn't really find support for that kind of progressive radicalizing. And so I intentionally wanted to be in a community where people were like me. And that was important for my healing. And so I did find this community in Boston, and the Catholic worker movement, which this community was informed by. It wasn't strictly a Catholic worker house, but it was informed by the movement. The Catholic worker movement was an anarchist radical movement beginning during the Depression in New York with Dorothy Day and Peter Maurin, who were radical Catholics. Dorothy Day had did the almost unimaginable act of converting to Catholicism as a woman and as a radical, and she found liberation in her beliefs. She found liberation in the teachings of Christ and liberation theology, really. And so her and Peter Maurin were able to craft and create this community, this ideology that really invited people back into what it meant to live a life that served the poor, and serving the poor and also challenging systems that created poverty and violence and war openly, challenging those systems openly. So activism, service, mercy, grace, care, love, compassion were all at the heart of the movement. And so I really resonated with those principles in the community in Boston. And it just so happens that many of the members of that community were actually practicing Buddhism. And so coming from Georgia, I had kind of left the church. My mother was still ministering and pastoring, but I had kind of had to actually break up with God. And after that breakup, I experienced a lot of freedom. And coming to Boston, I still considered myself somewhat spiritual, but not practicing anything. And I had a deep, deep intellectual relationship with Buddhism, but not really interested in practicing. So I thought.
That changed.
Well, something changed and it didn't change. So about a year and a half of living in the community, I realized I was experiencing severe clinical depression. It was something that I'd been experiencing for years, but I couldn't recognize that. I grew up in such a context where I was taught that mental illness wasn't something that I could suffer from, because mental illness and the way mental illness is taught and the way mental illness is related to is so racialized. And so growing up in the Black community, we didn't talk about mental health. We didn't think about that. So Black people couldn't be mentally ill. We were oppressed. White people were mentally ill.
Right. We have different problems than these.
Yeah, yeah. Our problem isn't being sick mentally. Our problem is being poor. You know,
And
maybe
other problems are not allowed. That's the risk and the danger with that.
we don't have space to be mentally ill. You know, so I was just there's no way I could be mentally ill. But again, I knew too much about, surviving and living. And of course, by then I had a college degree and I had taken psychology, so it was very clear that I was clinically depressed. I had actually been in therapy previously after moving to Boston, but I didn't really find a lot of benefit personally for me. So when I realized I was depressed, I literally couldn't get out of bed. I was completely, there was absolutely no motivation, nothing going on for me. I was scared. So I promised myself that I would try anything and everything to work with depression. And when nothing worked, I would actually go and just seek to, to find medication. I would go back, you know, to my therapist and then ask to explore medications. So I felt like I had a safety net. And so, but until that happened, I just decided to explore possibilities and options. And really what that meant was I just would hang out with people that I felt were spiritual, with Buddhists, Christian Science healers, Muslims, different practitioners in Christian denominations, all kinds of people. And I got a lot out of it. And most of these people are still very close to me. But what really changed was actually meeting a Christian healer, who actually helped me to start meditating, as part of my treatment. It was actually mindfulness I was practicing along with energy work and so forth. I really, in about 3 or 4 months, really saw a huge difference. In about a year, was completely out of the depression. However, while beginning to formally sit, I really developed a love of meditation and sitting practice. So when I really came out of enough of the depression to function, I felt my spiritual self opening up and awakening. So I went back to church. Church was amazing. Church was great, but it wasn't deeply fulfilling something. And so I decided to focus more attention on Buddhism, you know, and early on, I realized that this was it. This was really the path. And what I realized, as I alluded to earlier, just a couple of minutes ago, I left something, but I didn't leave something, So what I realized, or rather that I started practicing, but I didn't start practicing. And so what I mean by that is that I realized I had been Buddhist my whole life, just like I had been practicing intersectionality for most of my life, but couldn't name it. So I'd been practicing Dharma because everything that I was being taught was things that I was already attempting to do, or things I had questions about. And so the experience of awakening to Dharma and Buddhist practice officially was really the experience of remembering something that I'd forgotten. It wasn't intense. It was more like, oh, that's right. I do this.
A recognition more than a moving into.
Right. It was just a recognition. So my aspirations to become a teacher were very early as well. And so when that aspiration dawned on me, it was like getting a download. I was reading Tenzin Palmo's book, Cave in the Snow, where she talks about spending 12 years in solitary retreat in India. And just, reading her book, it was just like reading this text where I was like so familiar with it. It wasn't anything extraordinary about what she was doing. And then in the middle of reading her book, that's when another download happened, or a light went off, or a light was turned on, and these aspirations just popped up, that I would do intensive retreat, that I would become a teacher, doing the work of social justice and racial justice, and that would spend part of my life as monastic. Those three things basically. And It was literally like I just got those 3 points. Like I didn't contemplate, I didn't think about it, I didn't journal. I just looked and they were there. Perfectly 3 points. So literally I'm sitting in my room reading this book. I put the book down and pause, and there are these 3 aspirations there. There was no thinking.
That's become your trajectory.
Well, I didn't have a choice. So what really happened was the realization that I had written a script and I was following the script and there was no deviation. So in that realization, a lot of trust developed. I just kind of trust the scripts, deeply trust the scripts. And I know that I'm being protected and guided, really intensely. And I just kind of let go and just did it. Like I know exactly what's going to happen, so I do it. I go for it. I don't resist, And so after that, the red carpet rolled out in a way. And so I found teachers. I found my tradition. I found my retreat program. I went through retreat. Now I'm doing the second part of this aspiration, which is social justice, racial justice, integrating Dharma with that.
Let's shift a little into that and this idea to write radical Dharma. How did that come about?
So after I finished retreat, I moved to DC and the Northern Virginia area where I ran a Dharma center called UDC. And about a year and a half, 2 years into that, I really felt like I needed to return to a graduate school, especially to pursue a Master's of Divinity degree, because so much of my identity was actually shifting into being a Buddhist minister. So I was a Lama, I am a Lama, but I say I'm a Lama, but I think like a minister. And so I really wanted training in that. And Harvard Divinity School was the best option for me. And so I applied, I got in, and left DC 2014. So the summer of 2014, if you remember, was the summer of Ferguson. Ferguson was going on. Also, Israel was bombing the Gaza Strip that summer. And so I was really intensely emotionally involved in those two things. So it felt like when I watched footage from the Middle East, it felt like every time I saw a bomb go off, I literally felt like that bomb was exploding on my head. Like it felt like PTSD. Like it was like every loud noise I heard was like a bomb. And I just didn't know what was happening. I had no idea what was going on. And then I would flip to footage of Ferguson and just felt like the despair as a Black male that I experienced my whole life was being reflected back to me from the experiences of this Black community, in Ferguson and Michael Brown and so forth. I felt like he was me. And I'd had similar experiences with cops and police where I could have easily have been shot and killed. And so all of that was really deeply impacting my emotional state. So I was in the process of moving that summer. So I moved back to Boston. And the first few days I was in Boston, Reverend Angel was passing through town. Reverend Angel and I had met probably a year before at Generation Next Buddha Teachers Conference out in California. So we had become kind of associates. We had spent a little bit of time together. She was like a celebrity. And at the time, I was just this new teacher doing local Dharma. I call it local Dharma in DC. And, just really felt like she was this master teacher, master trainer, master social change leader. And so we had reconnected again that summer. We had spent some time together in a retreat. And then just a week later, she was passing through Boston. I had just moved back a couple of days before, and I just invited her to stay over with me as she passed through. She just passed through for a day. She spent the night with me. And so we just kind of spent the day just sitting together and, I call fellowshipping, so we just kind of fellowship together. And I just really started talking about what I was experiencing between the bombings in the Middle East and with Ferguson, and just really trying to acknowledge how I felt really traumatized. And I never used that word before, but all of a sudden I felt traumatized. I felt really paranoid. I felt really angry. I felt fatigued. I felt despair. I felt hopelessness. I felt all of that coming at once. And on top of that, that very same day we were together is when Robin Williams was found dead. We were actually sitting together that evening, and we were, just online on the computers and so forth. And she looked up to me. She was like, "Oh, Robin Williams was just found dead." And, she was like, apparently a suicide from complications around depression and so forth. And it just hit me really hard. And the first thing thought, I was like, God, I understand. I understand what it means to suffer with that kind of depression and the choices you have to take your own life. And so that hit really hard. And so just processing that with Reverend Angel, she left the next day, and I was just continuing to work with things. And then an editor from Buddha Dharma reached out to me and wanted me to do a dialogue project for the magazine. And he wanted me to pick an established teacher to do that dialogue with. And of course, the first person I thought of was Reverend Angel. And I was also given permission to talk about anything that I wanted to talk about. And I just felt like, since racial trauma was what I was dealing with, and how racial trauma and racism was being held in our sanghas, I really felt like that was very topical. So we did that dialogue, and it was recorded, transcribed for the magazine, and it was released the day in 2014 in November, that day when the officer who actually shot Michael Brown, who actually killed Michael Brown, the grand jury decided not to indict. And so a lot of protesting and everything, started, happening. And that video apparently went viral. And of course, I wasn't really on social media then. Besides Facebook, I wasn't on Twitter or Instagram, anything like that. So I didn't really know until people came back and told me, that video of us was everywhere, and people were watching it and studying it, that sanghas were watching it at their sittings, that classes were streaming it, that people would get together and watch it and talk about it. It was just really interesting. And then Reverend Angel and I just talked about the impact of that one video, and we said, what would happen if we were to really have a longer conversation about this, and to do this, to take it on the road.
And for folks who are listening, by the way, I am embedding in the episode page a video of a dialogue between Rod and Angel. So you can please do watch that there. That's why I put it on the page for you.
And that was the beginning of Radical Dharma, so everything happened very quickly. And we didn't really know what it was.
How did Jasmine get involved?
So Yasmin is a student of Reverend Angel. And Yasmin was tapped by Reverend Angel to help us organize. To initially organize the talks, because we couldn't do it. We didn't really have the space to organize. So Yasmin stepped in to organize the tour itself. And then during the tour, she started to participate in some of the dialogues that we were doing. And then when we began to work on the manuscripts, we invited her on board to write with us.
So in the book, and you each have parts to the book that you've written on your own. In yours, you talk about anger and about love. Tell us about how those show up in your life and why they're in the book.
So when we were writing the book, two things that we did. We looked at the themes that seemed to be echoed through our dialogues, And secondly, we thought about the aspects of this dialogue that were important to us in our practice. And that's where these distinct voices really come from. And my passion, my concern is around healing and love. So anger and love are very important parts of my practice. Anger has been so much a teacher for me. And it wasn't until I started loving my anger that the teachings of anger emerged for me, where anger wasn't this thing that I felt I was powerless against. After I started really loving and appreciating anger, it actually started talking to me. It actually started showing me that my anger was actually covering up this deep sense of despair and woundedness. And that anger actually pointed me to where that despair and anger, to where that despair and woundedness was. I was actually able to go and sit within that woundedness and take care of it, to love the woundedness as much as I love the anger.
And that's very counterintuitive for us to love something that is, at least in our society, tend to be frowned upon, at the very least.
Right. I had to love anger because it was a part of my experience. So I have to love every bit of my experience in order to achieve realization and enlightenment ultimately, or realization.
So let's talk a little bit, shifting to this topic that we're in with race and privilege and all the rest. Have you encountered avoidance of dialogue about the problems that we're seeing?
Oh, absolutely. There's both an avoidance of the dialogue, and when the dialogue happens, this really intense ignorance of what's really happening. And I don't know, honestly, I don't know which is worse, the willful ignorance or the conversation from a place of ignorance. Personally, sometimes I try to avoid. I don't know which one I would rather have, but I think, once I, am more honest about it, of course, conversation is important, but sometimes the conversation can be very wounding, itself. And so what I see from, a lot of white folks is just, it's very hard for white folks to tap into the reality of racialization, the racialization of whiteness, because whiteness is so normalized now.
Right. It's a pervasive part of our society, and that makes it all the more difficult when there's a willful ignorance around it.
Right. And this kind of avoidance of the racialization of whiteness is really seen when people are like, well, I'm not white, I'm actually Italian, actually Irish or German. And, when we step back and we look at the development of whiteness, of course, whiteness was only limited to certain groups of white people, so the Irish, Jewish folks, Italians had to earn whiteness. Anglo-Saxons kind of held whiteness. English folks held whiteness. So whiteness was actually about class, to a certain extent. But especially here in America, when the nation started becoming more diversified, you start actually having many kinds of brown and black people entering into the country, then it became a survival strategy. So it didn't matter what money you had. Like, if you were white skinned, you were white.
Right. And you were accorded a degree of societal privilege regardless.
So it was really about money, honestly, money and power. And so getting people to cut through, like, this idea of nationality, to get back into the reality that white skin accords certain privileges is really difficult. And of course, one of the pushbacks that, is very common is that, oh, well, I didn't enslave anyone. I wasn't a part of Jim Crow. Like, that was before I was born.
And perhaps technically correct.
Very,
That's
very,
nonetheless.
yeah, it's absolutely correct. It's absolutely, your present incarnation, was not a part of physically enslaving Black folks. I get that, but that's not actually what we're talking about. What
That's a
we're
red
actually,
herring argument that's meant to displace it to something that it isn't.
it isn't, and so what we're talking about is that you benefit from the systems, the kinds of violence that those who have come before you have established. That's what we're talking about. That everything that you have is actually because of this unearned privilege of whiteness.
And it's very difficult, I think, for many folks to see that because it challenges their narrative of I'm self-made. I am successful entirely based on my own work in isolation, as if there is anything that occurs in a vacuum. It's not. There's an entire structure there that helped you, if you're white, get through these because of that tacit acceptance of one's position, quotey fingers here, in society because of being white.
Right. Absolutely. So there's white racial trauma. There is a trauma associated with white racialization that we have not even gotten close to examining and looking at. Of course, there's huge pushback against that. Oh, white people can't be traumatized. But as I repeat often and teach on, any body that's racialized is a traumatized body. Racialization is an unnatural process that is imposed upon bodies.
Yes, and again, an identification, again, an ossification of identity that is not nearly giving honor to the complexity of what's going on.
Again, we oversimplify everything.
Right. So, Rod, how does this change? This is the difficult question part. How does this change? What do you see as the action steps? Bearing in mind, those are going to be different for people of color than they are for whites.
And I would say for white people, there has to be a process of learning to listen. Learning to listen to voices of people of color. So we've been having these serious, protests, actions for several years now. For almost 3 years, perhaps. I would say even since Trayvon Martin. And Black Lives Matter, so the emergence of Black Lives Matter has actually, I think, in many ways shifted the conversation to be more specific, about what's really happening. And I really encourage white people to listen, not to just say, oh, I don't know why, Black people are complaining. I don't know, they're just whatever, to actually listen.
Yeah, and it's okay to not know. It's not okay to stick your fingers in your ears and refuse to listen and not then I'd say the next step, take action, do something. And it's not for
Yeah, and so you listen, and the action that you have to take is actually the work of decentering whiteness. So it's connecting to white racialization and then decentering that racialization. And that's something that we have to look at other white people doing the work to do, so that decentering whiteness isn't something that I can do. And that's the work white people have to do within their communities.
and a resistance to that comes up very frequently is exactly what you were referring to a few moments ago is, but I didn't create this. It doesn't matter. This is still the society that you're in. And nor, by the way, did the people of color who are suffering from this create the situation.
Right. And so so identity has been actually built on the privileges of whiteness. So to dismantle whiteness is actually to challenge identity. That's where we're going to see the trauma. So how do you actually create identities that actually are not about power, hierarchy, privilege, and class maintenance or whatever? how do you establish an identity that is about connecting and collaboration and love and passion, and at the same time holding the space for the reality that you won't actually be able to dismantle the privileges of whiteness completely, that the privilege of whiteness will be something that it will exist for a long time, but how do you hold the space of saying, okay, I identify as white, I have these privileges that I actually get without any consent, and what can you really do about something that you're just being given and you don't know where they're coming from, you don't know how they're given. How do you balance that with this intention, this aspiration to interrogate that privilege and to spread resources out, to share resources, to center whiteness and to center the voices of marginalized people?
I think part of that's also going to be being a little more accepting of making mistakes, understanding that there's going to be discomfort, there's going to be friction. These are growing pains, and they're, I think, something that it's part of this growth and this change that we need to make, because without it, none of us are in a good place with this society that is today very fractured, at least here in the U.S. So maybe a little more, hopefully a fun question on this is what do you want to be asked? What is it you want to share with the listeners?
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing I'll share with the listeners too is, okay, the work that people of color have to do in doing in this movement of healing. And I speak particularly from my experiences of being Black and within the Black community. One of the things that I'm really promoting is mental health. But, there's a lot of oppression that's transmitted through mental health services. So really identifying mental health services that actually are engaged in anti-oppression, anti-racism interrogation. So finding those services, working with professionals, programs, organizations, and so forth that are able to start holding space and developing treatments, for Black people, for Black folks who have for centuries really suffered from not only intergenerational trauma, but also transhistorical trauma. So I really want to say that and put that out there, and that self-care is so important. The self-care that leads to decreasing suffering and liberation from suffering. That kind of self-care is very important. And then another question, and, lastly, I think something that's really important to me is really coming back and honoring complexity again. So I think sometimes we put people on pedestals and we expect them to always be on point with a specific argument, a specific line. But I think that gets us into trouble. So I think about my experience, and, some people get really angry when, I say or do something that isn't in line with like radical belief. And I say things within my friend groups and I make these statements and these comments. And if people hear that, they're like, but you're supposed to be X, Y, and Z, and then I say, well, I'm much more complex than that. My basic ethic is to look at the harm that I create for myself and the harm that I create for others around, and trying to cut through that, trying to interrogate the violence that I'm a part of. But that doesn't mean that like I'm this kind of like this meek angel that kind of walks around and is completely like socially realized, because I'm not. So I have blind spots as well. We all have blind spots.
And I think people often forget that teachers are people. And when we put them on a pedestal, there's a creation of a separation, and that has led to some very unhealthy outcomes. We see this in various, we're going all really on the far end of things like cults, and we've had enough interviews on this podcast of people who've gotten out of those kinds of situations to see where that can lead. But even on a more basic level, as you're saying, that if you say or do anything that is not expected or doesn't fit an ideal, that's a problem. I was recently called out on my words being ignorant on whiteness and white privilege, and as if what I'd said was an attack on the standard meaning. It's not that at all. It's just we need to look at all the data, not just the stuff that fits what draws us. And I get that that's relevant too. And of course, there is a systemic precedence for white ideals to automatically have a certain strength and power to them, and that's something to combat. Totally agree. But things, as you're saying, there's a complexity to that, and it's not always going to be exactly just so.
Yeah.
Well, our guest today, Lama Owens. You can find out more about Lama at lamarod.com, and I'll be linking that to the episode page on this episode, along with, of course, the book, Radical Dharma, and the video I mentioned will be embedded on the episode page for this episode. Rod, thank you so much for being here.
Absolutely. This was wonderful.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.